Good morning, everybody, here in the building and out there in TV land. This morning we'll be talking about a lesson from Leviticus, everybody's favorite book of the Bible, I'm sure. Definitely mine. It comes from Leviticus, the first chapter, verses 3 through 17. And I'm going to skip just reading the whole thing because it's a little more than usual. But just some lesson context. It says the book of Leviticus is one of the 5 books collectively known as the Pentateuch, traditionally ascribed to Moses. The contents of it as a whole are best viewed as deriving originally from Moses and carrying his authority. So these are all the rules pertaining to the faith. The title reflects that the fact that the book relates to the task of the Levites, who assisted the priest in carrying out duties associated with worship at the tabernacle. And we recall all the priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. A key word in Leviticus is holy. Holiness refers to a state of being set apart, including both ritual and ethical purity. The words, "Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy," are directed not only to all the people of ancient Israel, but to all of God's people through time. It's also to be noted that the love your neighbor as yourself actually comes from Leviticus. Of course, Jesus cited this as one of the 2 greatest commands. So these scriptures are about to get into some real technical stuff about sacrifice. And when you first read it, it's one of those things when I read, when I was reading through the Bible before I get to this part, my brain kind of goes, because you're like, why am I reading this? What has this got to do with the whole story I'm supposed to be getting here? But as with everything in the Bible, there is a reason. Of course, it was very important for the Israelites to know all this stuff, but it's also important for us to understand what it meant. So starting with the scripture, it said, starting with verse 3a, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. And so this says the verse narrows the focus specifically to that of a burnt offering that comes from the herd. So it has to be a herd offering. The directive to sacrifice only animals without defect is repeated in Deuteronomy. This command reflects a key distinction between profane and sacred things. It also emphasizes that God deserves the best of one's herd rather than the worst. And it gives an extended warning against unacceptable sacrifices. So you couldn't really hedge your bets here. You had to bring what he wanted you to bring. It says centuries later, the prophet Malachi would charge God's people with violating this prohibition. So they actually had started doing that. The added specification that the blemish-free sacrifice be male foreshadows the sacrifice of Jesus. So as usual, we try to see all this through the lens of Jesus Christ, which is what we do, right? Being Christians, that's how we see the Bible. And of course the Bible is, the whole thing, in my opinion, is about Jesus. The rest of that verse says, you must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. The burnt offering could not be presented just anywhere the giver desired. So again, these instructions are specific. You had to do it this way. The worshiper had to bring it to the place specifically designated for such a sacred purpose, the tabernacle. When I read that, I kind of thought to myself, so he wanted you to come to his house to do it, right? And then we kind of, during the whole COVID situation, I felt like a lot of people got to where I can sit at home and just watch it on whatever and get it. Which, some people had to do that. They have things going on, and that's fine. But I feel like if you can make it to a church, the experience is a little bit different, and I feel like you get something more from that. So I'm not saying God specifically wants us to be at church, but I think he does probably, Just reading this is kind of enforces that. Only then would the sacrifice be considered acceptable to the Lord. What conforms to his requirements and what pleases him, which is the whole point. The Lord was to be worshipped on his terms, at the sole place designated for that purpose. He instituted strict penalties for performing sacrifices in any other location. And so this is kind of anticipating the future temple in Jerusalem. This requirement forced the Israelites to worship the Lord alone in a consistent way and prevented them from continuing their practices of sacrificing to goat idols. So there was a reason for that at the time. We all know that the whole culture at large at the time, it was more of a multi-theist type situation. Most societies believed in multiple gods, not one. So this is, I think, God saying, you got to come and worship me at my house and do what I ask you to do, because I am the one true God. Verse 4 says, you are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. So we kind of get into the gist of what this is about. When you make a burnt offering, it's for your atonement. The first instruction to put a hand on the head of the burnt offering brings out that whole situation where it's kind of for you. This is the first of a multi-step procedure. The placement of the hand symbolizes the person's submission of the animal as a sacrifice on their behalf. So you're choosing this animal to take your place in atonement. Verse 5 says, you are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It says, as the procedure continues to follow steps, we may wonder who did the hands-on work to slaughter the young bull. The context implies that it was the one who had brought the animal to be sacrificed. After that, Aaron's sons, the priest, took over to perform the rest of the task regarding the blood. So the people actually killed the animal themselves there. It says the priest who sorry, I got lost here. But Leviticus 14:19-20 mentions a priest who was to slaughter the animal. In any case, a priest has to be present to officiate. So there's a little bit of, was it the person, was it the priest? As with some things in the Bible, I don't exactly know. To me, it would make more sense that the person bringing it would do it. Maybe some people didn't want to do that. I don't know. The use of blood as described functions as a mechanism of purification. It reinforces the principle of atonement, since, as the Lord later declared, the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. So the blood is very important. That's why they do what they do with it. Verse 6 says, you are to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. So all these instructions are pretty specific. There'd be a lot of modern people that probably won't want to have anything to do with this, but it's how they did it. It's and if you were following the instructions correctly, you had to do it this way. The next step was the removal of the animal's hide. This might be either prior to or simultaneously with cutting the carcass into pieces. It says Leviticus 7:8 directed the priest officiating at the burnt offering should receive the animal's hide. So the priest actually gets the hide. Verse 7, the sons of Aaron, the priest, are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. So here again, we're having some specific instructions. Only priests were allowed to carry out the act of sacrificing the animal prepared for the burnt offering. The phrase put on the altar does not mean to start the fire, because the fire for this altar was to burn continuously. So the idea they think is that they were to stoke the fire. Verse 8 says, then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat on the wood that is burning on the altar. So that doesn't really get into much detail about this. There is certain spots in Exodus and Leviticus that kind of specify the pieces in greater detail. Verse 9 says, you are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So the aroma pleasing to the Lord is what I remember most about reading this stuff before. Because just kind of the way I think. Sometimes I wonder, is my life an aroma pleasing to the Lord? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Does it pass the smell test, as they say? But this is what these offerings are doing at the time. It says the verse concludes the description of the ritual that began in Leviticus 1:4. The resulting smoke that creates an aroma pleasing to the Lord attributes a human characteristic, a sense of smell to God. This is an anthropomorphic language. And somebody smarter than me probably knows what that word means. It says even though God is spirit, the scriptures speak of him as having physical characteristics. It says here the sense of smell depicts how the Lord was pleased with the burnt offering that's presented in the manner set forth in the text. And so in this lesson, it lays out the exact steps that we just went through. And there's 10 of them, which I'm not going to read through all that again. But it was very specific on how you had to do this stuff. Another reason I'm glad we have Jesus. Because I would miss something in there, because it's just how I am. So, but yeah, they had to follow that to the letter. Verse 10 says, if the offering is a burnt offering from the flock, from either the sheep or the goats, you are to offer a male without defect. So now we're going, before it was a bull, now we're going into some different kind of offerings. These are more specifically, of course, geared to the sheep and the goats. So for this kind of offering, sheep or goat that were male without defect, which was the same as before, were interchangeable with the young bull. We see male goats and sheep themselves as interchangeable for Passover also. Either goats or sheep were acceptable for fellowship offerings, with either male or females allowed. Either bulls, male or female goats, or female lambs are allowed for sin and trespass offerings, depending on the nature of the sin. So that kind of gets into the rest of those offerings, not necessarily the offerings, for atonement. They had different kind of offerings for different kind of things. And so it looks like the rules kind of get a little more lax as they go down for that. Verse 11 says, you are to slaughter it at the north side of the altar before the Lord. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall splash its blood against the sides of the altar. So again, here we go with some specific instructions. Okay. How many of y'all know which way north is right now? So I doubt they have a compass in this either, so you'd have to, hopefully the priest knows. I know my wife has no idea. Here, a specific instruction was given as to where the animal was to be slain at the north end of the altar. So this is specifically talking about where you had to kill the animal. Why this was required is not entirely clear, although it may have something to do with the fact that the tabernacle and the gateway into its courtyard faced east, so which is probably how it was oriented. This rationale may also combine in some way with the need to distinguish this offering from the one taken from the herd. Other than that, the procedure at this point is the same. So, there again, what we can get from that is really specific about what they're doing. Verse 12 says, "You are to cut it into pieces, and the priest shall arrange them, including the head and the fat, on the wood that is burning on the altar." Again, the procedure is the same as that designated for the bovines. Verse 13 says, "You are to wash the internal organs and legs with water. The priest is to bring all of them and burn them on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord." Yet again, the procedure is the same as with the bull. So, that's just repeating some of the stuff we heard earlier. It's specific in what you had to do. So verse 14 says, "If the offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, you are to offer a dove or a young pigeon." So now we're getting into some different animals you can offer for your atonement. Again, this option for a burnt offering was provided for people who could not afford to bring the aforementioned offerings from a herd or flock. So, this is for people that didn't have that stuff. Wealth in that time was measured by how many animals you had a lot of times. Not everybody had that. So you could actually bring something that was easier for you to get in the form of a bird, a dove, or a pigeon, which I thought was pretty interesting. Such an option was provided to women after childbirth who could not afford to offer a lamb for the burnt offering of purification, which is another type of sacrifice. One may recall the sacrifice that Joseph and Mary offered following the birth of Jesus, which is, kind of what they did. Verse 15 says, the priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off the head, burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained on the side of the altar. So again, it's offering specific instructions on how to do this stuff. It says the procedure for offering a bird as a burnt offering differed from that, from offering that from a herd or a flock, whereas the blood of animals that were sacrificed was sprinkled around the altar of the burnt offering. The bird's blood was to be drained out on the side of the altar. Though the bird's blood would not be nearly as abundant as that of the other animals, the need to separate its blood from its body must be completed. Israelites were forbidden to eat blood, which I didn't really realize that. I don't know if anybody else did. That's one of those specific things about the Israelites. Verse 16 says, "He is to remove the crop and the feathers and throw them down east of the altar where the ashes are." It says the meaning of a bird's crop is uncertain, which when I read it the first time, I said, "What's crop? What is that?" And I just thought I didn't know, But it says it may refer to the pouch near the gullet or throat, the craw, where the bird stores food temporarily before digestion. Another option is that it may refer to the lower intestines. Its removal may be compared to removing the intestines from the animals of the herd or flock. The place of ashes that was beside the altar to have been a temporary location for ashes, the ultimate destination for that refuse was outside the camp. So that's why they were putting those things there. kind of very specific, a little bit gory, I guess, if some people may think it was, but this is how all this worked. This is what all that sacrifice that they had to do and how they specifically had to do it was. Verse 17 says, "He shall tear it open by the wings, not dividing it completely, and then the priest shall burn it on the wood that is burning on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, as aroma pleasing to the Lord." It says further instructions regarding the sacrifice of birds conclude this portion of the text. The anatomy of a bird is quite different from that of sheep, goats, and bovines, of course. Thus, the sacrificial procedure was quite different. The priest was solely responsible for preparing and presenting the bird as a burnt offering. Though not as monetarily valuable as something offered from the flock or the herd, this offering still produced an aroma pleasing to the Lord, which was the point of what they were doing. Whether the worshiper was well-to-do or impoverished made no difference to the Lord, who treats everyone alike. As followers of Jesus, our duty is to offer to God not burnt sacrifices of animals or birds, but our lives as a living sacrifice. Which I kind of thought to myself, that is what we should be doing, of course. But, as tedious as this whole procedure that we just went through was, wouldn't it be easier just to, I'm going to go do this to atone for what I did yesterday, or did last week, or whenever it was, instead of actually getting your life right and not doing it again. Anyway, you don't have to worry about doing this stuff. Of course, we know Jesus was the ultimate offering and took our place in that. It says our sacrifices do include the monetary, but are primarily spiritual, consisting of fruit of the lips, offering our thanks to God, and the good deeds we do as salt and light in our spheres of influence. So there again, we just go back to, what we should be doing. Are we living that way? Are we the light that we should be? And we all know that life throws all kinds of stuff at you, sometimes in a quick way, and sometimes we don't react like we're supposed to. I do that a lot. You don't just stand back and go, oh, wait a minute, how am I supposed to react to this? You just kind of react. And a lot of times when you react, that's when you get in trouble. So, but our life is to be a living sacrifice. So you have to hold, God first. It's not really about what you want in your life. And sometimes that's hard to get there. I realize that completely. The conclusion for this says the burnt offerings in the Old Testament. The burnt offerings is the first of several kinds of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. The burnt offerings is mentioned first, but perhaps because it was the most committal. The one presenting the sacrifice received nothing tangible back. At first glance, in Deuteronomy 12:27 would seem to contradict that statement, but this exception applies to Israelites who lived too far from the tabernacle to make the trip there. So, burnt offerings are mentioned about 270 times in the Old Testament. Their association with atonement makes study of them important in light of the New Testament passages in Mark and in Hebrews. Of course, so this, we always joke about this book, likes to say how many times a bird was mentioned and what that means and all that. But the point it's getting across, of course, is this is an important thing to know about. Even if your brain, when I was talking about this, did what mine usually does and goes, what are we talking about? Skinning out a deer, what are we doing? But it is important in the actual story that we need to know. It says, through the sacrificial system, God demonstrated the necessity of total commitment to Him, His desire to be present with His people, and the seriousness of sin. And He wanted people to understand that, as Paul puts it in Romans, the wages of sin is death. But God in His grace has always provided a substitute so that we do not have to pay those wages. Of course, that's what, we get that ultimately through Christ. Those substitutes foreshadowed the ultimate substitute who God in time would provide, Jesus, whose sacrifice at the cross was also a fragrant offering. The once-for-all sacrifice that fulfilled what and who the Old Testament sacrifices pointed towards. So like I said, the whole Bible is kind of pointing towards Jesus. Indeed, as Paul puts it, our lives are to spread the aroma of the knowledge of Christ everywhere. Do we do that? There's a good smell coming off of you every day. Or is it someone seeing you on a Monday morning when you're not in a good mood? What kind of fragrance is coming off of you then? Or on a Wednesday afternoon when it's chaos and somebody's wanting something from you. How good is it working then? What do you smell like? Sometimes I probably don't smell too great, I'm sure. The thought to remember this is always worship God on His terms, not ours. And I thought, like I said, before, COVID kind of is a time that it all went a little crazy, but I think in some places and some spots we probably haven't ever really recovered from it. But we have to remember that God is God, and we do have to do it on His terms. I think some people like to sometimes make up stuff, for lack of a better way to put it. I did this, I did that. I'm a good person. Who needs this Jesus fella? I give to all these people. I help all these people out, all that. But they're missing the whole thing. You're missing the whole concept, the whole truth of what we're here and supposed to be doing. So when I opened up the lesson and started reading it, I was kind of thinking to myself, of course I got Leviticus this week. I love that because I'm one of the ones I always tell the people in our class, I like it when it's one of the Gospels. We just talk about Jesus the whole time, because to me that's the easy stuff. But I think we have to make ourselves understand that we need to know all this stuff about what's in the Bible, because it is God's Word. You can't be foo-fooing just because you don't like it. It is God's Word. And a lot of times what happens in society, and there's another thing that happens, just because you don't like what it says, still don't make it any less true, okay? So you have to, get over and get going. So, and I'm just as guilty as anybody else. I'll read something and go, I don't know about that. Well, you better. So, but at any rate, I hope y'all got something out of that rambling stuff. I hope everybody has a good week. When we make it back here next week, and everybody have a good day.